eventually when you become an artist, you don't become an artist to win. It is actually how you lose, which is the most important thing.
Einen wunderschönen guten Abend. I welcome you for this evening. We are very proud to host this talk with Luc Teuilleman and moderated by Peter Swinnen. And it's a great collaboration with the ETH. Peter Swinnen at the moment is a guest lecturer there. That's the reason why this lecture came together this way. And they have a fantastic topic. You read it. I prefer not to. And we are actually curious what this, let's say, critical resistance or slight resistance or minimal resistance will be about. Peter Swinnen, for the few non-architects here in the room, I should introduce him. He owns his own architecture firm, Crit, in Brussels, so everyone who wants to Google. He curated 2013 the ambition of the territory at the Venice Architecture Biennial and is, as I said, since 2016, he has been a guest lecturer here at the ETH. And Luc Teuilleman, I think you all know by his paintings, and he's, I would say, one of the most adored painters for his generation. And we're more than curious to hear what he will tell to this theme. I just heard that he doesn't like to say no. Yeah. So we will get to know more soon. So I wish you a nice evening, and that's it. I pass on to Peter Swinnen.
Thank you.
Good evening, and welcome. Thank you to the Migros Museum for Contemporary Art. Thank you also, Heike, for this introduction and the very generous gesture. Alena, equally. Maybe start with a small anecdote. This morning, when I was flying from Brussels to Zurich, I was reading this booklet, which, if you don't have it, you should try to get it if it's still available. It's Doué pour la peinture, on Luc Teuilleman's Conversations with Jean-Paul Jungo. It's a book that Luc gave to my wife, Anna Yudong, 10 years ago. And when I started reading it, almost by accident, in the introduction, one can read, let's say, the potential relationship of Luc with Switzerland, which I think is not a kind of innocent thing. In 1992, at the Kunsthalle Bern with Ulrich Lok, who the back then director of the Kunsthalle, actually invited Luc for the, not for the first international solo exhibition, but I think for the second one.
Outside of my country.
Outside of Belgium, of course, yes. So I think it was a very important moment. 1992 was also, I think, an important moment because we had Documenta 9, which also, through Lok, in a way, was pushed towards Jan Hoed. But also, 1992 was the origin of Der Diagnostische Blick. Sorry for my German, it's non-existing. Which was actually the very first thematic exhibition that you developed. But also, I think, an exhibition which at the same time created a kind of voluntary distance towards, let's say, the objects which were portrayed or the people who were portrayed. And you can agree.
I will talk about it myself.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
But also, and maybe try to link to the theme of I prefer not to, the impossibility of determining the psychology of the portrait person, kind of voluntary distance. And for those of you who don't know, I prefer not to, but I think most of you probably do. It's a lecture series. It's not the fifth lecture in the series. And again, we're extremely glad that Luc accepted. It's based on a novella by Herman Melville from Moby Dick, 1853, about a character who actually, a very dull character, who develops the capacity of saying no each time he's asked to do a job. do read it. I'm not going to explain the whole thing. Do read it. But within this novella, I think the idea of passive resistance, and I think in the case of Luc, maybe active resistance occurs, which a theme that we find very important, both in the field of architecture, but also in the arts and in human culture altogether. And I could even imagine, but now, and then I'm going to stop, that I prefer not to could be a title for one of your books or exhibitions. But this was my last thought in the plane when I stepped down.
Yeah, well, there is another title of which I will talk about my last show in that I did in New York, which is called Le Mépris. Right. So that comes a bit close.
Okay. Luc, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So, good evening. We could also do this in German, but I'm going to do it in English. I cannot do it in Schweizerdeutsch. I can only say Grüße miteinander. That's about it. So, but that means that if there are questions afterwards, you can also ask them in German, and I can answer them in German. But the talk will be in English. So we just go to the first work, which is a work from '78. And this is actually a work that was made before I started filming. I also show you one little bit of film that was filmed in the beginning of the 80s, a couple of seconds from now. But this was the idea of recreating a film image. Of this, there's also a body of work that was made years later, but then based upon when I took the screen away and filmed this. But we'll talk about that when we get there. I made a selection of works that doesn't include a lot of portraits, but I did include the diagnostical view because of the reasons that already are indicated by Peter. But mostly to go into the idea of surrounding interiors, spaces, and even some kind of, there are a couple of landscapes actually also. Because I think there is a link between the image, or an image, and architecture, and vice versa. There is also an idea why I work with tonality instead of, for example, color. Or if we would make, if we make a comparison between, let's say, Ellsworth Kelly, which I really like, where you have a very straightforward color and a straightforward proposition, an heroic one in a sense. But seeing the country and the region I come from, we're much more into realism, but also into tonality, which tonality means that it's very difficult to remember, and it works on your brain in the long run. I once had a guy in Honolulu who hated my work from the museum in Honolulu, and he went to see the Tate Modern show and hated it even more, and then he started to dream about it, and he became my biggest fan. What you see here is a work called The Arena. It's based upon the idea of a Greek arena, so already a surrounding which is a mythological surrounding. And instances of photographs that I cut up from boat people out of 1942. And they were glued onto little wooden structure that comes closer to the calc paper you see that gives the diffused light of the work. It was a sort of an intentional work of getting close to the idea of a film image, but also an intentional way of showing the idea, and we're talking about this idea of passive aggressive, the idea of violence. Second one is a space and a non-space. This was then after all the film situations. So the one I showed before was 1978, this is 1985, and it's called La Correspondance, and it's based upon a specific anecdote. It's a writer Van Oudshoorn who was stationed in 1905, from 1905 to 1910 in Berlin. He's a really famous Dutch writer, but I don't think he's translated. But he didn't have the money to bring his wife along, so every afternoon he had lunch. He went to these big restaurants, which were very bourgeois, elaborate, and they also sometimes had postcards. So he bought a postcard, and with a red pencil he crossed on the table the space where he had eaten, and during the period of 5 years he sent that to his wife. That's the anecdote. What really interests me about is how to formulate an idea, because this is more a conceptual thing, into a space, and into the idea of transparency in a sense. So actually the bourgeois element became the wallpaper, the cross became, and the rest became like nearly a clinical setting, and very devoid of any form of any form in itself, actually, basically. It's just a very direct way of putting it. But on the other hand, it is also an element that, and a space that is opened up within the space of the painting. This then went further into antichambre, which is basically a complete copy of a very small piece of paper, which was a decoupage drawing for a thing I filmed, which was a chandelier that moved in a space. So nothing is spontaneous in this painting. Everything is reproduced. I mean, with the pencil in the wet paint, I made the sort of like the little squares in the paper. And then you also have the pencil, which is monkeyed, and you have the ballpoint and the fountain pen, which is actually the chandelier itself. It was, for me, important to be able to reproduce a drawing into a painting, because a painted line is never a drawn line. It's a different thing. It can be the contour, it can be the shadow, or it cannot be even painted. It can be an imaginarity. But also it is a different entity than, let's say, the pencil. It was very interesting to make a blow-up also. Probably also due to the idea of the film experience. So there were many more of these paintings, but they were stopped at a certain point. And then it came to this painting, which was a bit more problematic. At a certain point, I started to ask myself, what would the point of departure be of making my oeuvre, in a sense? And I took a specific point of departure in time. I mean, something that was still sort of alive in my family and not at the same time as it was based upon something that was real or had a real history, and especially a history of violence. And therefore I took something as an anthem like the Second World War as a starting block, because that was this exact period where Europe lost his powers, his colonies, and through the Holocaust, a sort of idea of a sort of psychological breakdown was formulated. This one, which is very weird, painted a year later than La Correspondance, is also, again, based upon a postcard. It's based upon a postcard which was distributed between the detainees, the people who were in this, this was a transitional camp, it's not a dead camp. In Theresienstadt, they were dealt out postcards that they could send to their families. And I found a book of Alfred Cantor, which is, if you can't find the book, it's a really interesting book. It's a book of a guy who actually survived Auschwitz and Schwarzheide, and eventually was liberated by the Russians, and they were reassembled, all these prisoners, into the starting point, which was actually Theresienstadt. So he just stole a cardboard box with these postcards, which he had used before when he was there, and to which he had written to his family, "This, our new quarters." Years later, in 1972, he starts a diary, not with words, but with drawings, and the first thing he does is glue this postcard in the beginning of the book and writes underneath in American English, "Our new quarters." When I painted this was like breaking a taboo. I actually painted the painting quite fast, so used a color which is a military color, a color which is a sort of non-color in a sense, which is this greenish color. After having painted the casemates like very fast onto it with extreme speed and the dead tree, the painting was not finished. So the title became actually part of the painting with a sort of white yellowish mix intended, it sort of lights up and it gives you the idea of a subtitle in a way. The next painting was even more problematic because it's more a concept than a painting. This is based upon a watercolor that I made on the spot in Dachau, which is one of the still surviving real gas chambers. And years after, because I had the watercolor laying around in my studio, and it's with an interval of maybe 4, 5, 6 years, and the paper had yellowed also, I actually made a painting out of it, taking into account also the fact that the paper had yellowed, and it's about revalidating the idea of a document. It also doesn't show corpses, it just shows the space, the empty space. Now in terms of saying no, in terms of this idea of violence that is defiant in itself, this is the ultimate point. It's also not on a square canvas. It's a canvas that has a sort of misfit. I mean, it goes in a specific angle on one side. And it's like if the ceiling and the floor actually close up to each other. And it has an element of warmth in it. It has which is the element of the skin, basically, that transpires through the yellowing of this specific watercolor that in itself also became a document. And as I say, it is problematic because without the title, it's just a cellar. But in a sense, already during the time when this space was used, it was presented as a shower room. So in a sense, it's already a deceit of a space in itself. And, but as I say, it remains one of the most ambiguous and complicated paintings because it goes beyond this situation. There's still another one, which is then called Schwarzheide, painted on a canvas which was grounded and put into the sunlight so that it would yellow sort of naturally. And then painted on it, you see that actually I visited this camp and there was only a blockhouse in which you could see actually the drawings of the prisoners who have, and out of fear of being detected, they've ripped the drawings in different sort of like pieces and distributed them. So most of these drawings were incomplete. Coming out of the blockhouse, I saw these, what do you call it, these trees, and took that away from me, and took that with me, and also sort of tried to remember the drawings were made in a certain substance which has this type of color. It was a sort of charcoal mixed with something else, a fluid, that gave it this sort of bluish, weird color. And the lines, of course, sort of symbolize what I just said. It's the element of the naturalization of death, basically. And another one out of these times is the rear mirror. Interesting because it is something you see, it's the rear mirror of a dais that is actually lying behind you. So it's something you actually can't see in a way. And then another anthem that will come back more in the other forms later is this one, which is the hotel room. Because the hotel room for me has always been fascinating because it's a room with a brain of its own. I mean, you can mess it up, but in the end it will sort of restore itself. It has this sort of like entity of being ultimately anonymous. I tried to make it a bit more tactile because this is made again from a drawing which is made with oil paint, so you see the element of the fat that goes into the paper. Now I'm going to try to show you a little piece of film. I mean, I have to click on it. So this is from '81. Okay, fine. If you see that piece of film, it gives you several ideas. It's a building in the harbor, which was a silo building, a cooling house in the sense that doesn't exist anymore for the 20s. Together with the train elements to it, it gets a different feel, it gets a different dimension, a different signifier. Especially coming to the foreground that you see here, which was actually painted in '88. And here there is a portrait in it, but it's not a real one, and I'll talk about it. So this is painted on an afternoon when I didn't have money to buy canvas, so I just chopped up a cardboard box. It is a wonder that the work still exists, in a sense, because it's painted with the poorest materials you can think of. Also, the other paintings you saw underneath those, there were 8 or 9 other paintings. I mean, they're overpainted in order to continue painting. I also overpainted paintings that I probably shouldn't have overpainted, but it was just the effect of keep on going, in a sense. And it started off here very innocently with the very first image you see, which also has a thing inscribed with the overpainted, which is nothing to see, nichts in Sicht. But it was niets in Sicht in Flemish, actually, it's overpainted. It was the idea of a bit based upon a time of day, like an afternoon, like the Pittura Metafisica, something like an imaginary urban setting. The second one, still innocent, actually could be a blow-up. Somewhere it's like an empty shop. And then I started looking, that was all in the same day, for other images. And I just stumbled upon those 2 tablets, which are the very first comprimés the Germans made in the Second World War to ship to the Eastern Front, which are vegetable comprimés, which were also used in the NASA program to go to the moon. And then the very last one is the portrait of Richard Heydrich, who was the main guy in the logistics, and the second one in the control of the SS, who was murdered in '42 by a Czech resistance group, but who was also the person from the Wannsee conference, in which in 4 hours they decided how they were going to eliminate 8 million people. And this is actually not a painting, because this is actually the head of Heydrich, cut out of this propaganda magazine from 1942, which was a sort of commemorative page when he was killed, and he was actually in a fencing outfit. But I just glued it on this painted surface, put it in front of a book, like a bookshelf, gave it, I mean, it has a sort of very surgical, it looks more like a doctor than something else, and then masked the face with the glasses and painted the hair. So the interesting thing was that the inside of that face and the very first painting, the urban one, sort of coincide in terms of the atmosphere, in terms of the light, in terms of the tonality, which gave me this idea of like putting on your, like winding up a watch, and that's why I called it Die Zeit. The other one comes out of publicity, was made right after this Die Zeit, and changed the color. It changed the color in terms of a specific, before that the colors were probably more warm, and here there is an element of coolness that comes in. I think the temperature is also a specific space within the image. And then there are several ones, which I'm going to show fast one after the other, which are based upon models. Fascination with the modeling world, in which you have the omnipotence to change everything, and you be the master of your own universe within its smallness. And I took actually these images that look real, but they are of course disproportionate, and they don't fit. And they also were painted in a way that the colors were sort of heightened, because they had to do with the idea of the object and the idea of plastic and material. When this was shown in the gallery, a lot of the people who liked the other works, for the first time started to realize that the former works also had a temperature and had a culture, and had color in a sense, in a way. I also wanted to make them in such a concise way, because they're already an object, so in that sense repainted them, and they're a toy, they get a specific form of vulgarity. The next one was a model that was still actually being created, of a church. And then quite an iconic image is the body, which is a real doll that I still actually have, which you can open up with zippers and then stuff it to make it come alive. It's painted with a specific medium underneath, so it would deteriorate earlier. So you would have actually sort of like huge cracks or craquelure that goes in an enhanced way. Not that the painting is falling apart, but it was like giving this idea of between cloth and porcelain at the same time. Also the fact that it's defaced or demembered, there is no genitals you can see, so the body takes over the place of the face in a sense. And it becomes a very element of identifying, but at the same time there is the element of scarification, which is eminent in the two lines, which you can see. It's an iconic image in the sense that it works with all these elements, you know. It works with the index, it works with the symbol and the icon at the same time. And of course, it has to do with a toy. It has to do with infants, innocence, and all that. When I saw the Infantes of Velázquez, it was interesting, and I was also always fascinated by the Infantes, not because of the faces, but because of the clothes, and especially the specific targeted bodies in a sense. Then another portrait I show is a non-portrait. This is actually, I wanted to paint an architect, Albert Speer. And in the process of doing so, I actually didn't do that. There's another painting of Albert Speer that will crop up much later, a couple of years later, and actually made it into a face that is on the one hand masked and actually closed in a sense. And it also has this element of a very secretive existence. The only thing that indicates the time period is actually the rim around which you see, which gives the idea of the uniform, and of course the colors of it. And this was during it's called sealed rooms, and it was because of the attacks on Israel I think during the first Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein actually sent out some missiles, and there was the fear of bacteriological warfare, and they taped all their rooms in a way. And so this is so you see one with a mirror, you see a bedroom, and you see one with a cupboard that is opened. Then something which is not a room, but is out of three entities: so the smell, Heiligt, and incest. So the very first one is just an abstract idea of an abstract idea, which is smell itself. The second is a more physical thing, which is about the idea of healing through light, which is based upon a very old photograph from a prosody that was made in 1948, which was the first idea of multiplying on a gigantic scale, like in magazines, the reproducing color photography, in a sense, by linotype. And the last is actually a sort of reminiscence of in something that is grabbing something or piercing something. And then the diagnostical view. So I'm only going to show two of them. This is the diagnostical view number 2, which has glasses. It's a person who actually had cancer. Well, both of them actually. When I was doing my show here in '92 in the Kunsthalle in Bern, I met a psychoanalyst. At that point, I hadn't really painted a lot of portraits. I had painted these toys, but not really. And there's this one painting that I showed you, which was much more an idiom than a painting. But I wanted to return back to, I wanted to make portraits, but not as I used to do in the old days, which were tormented, but I wanted to make portraits without any sense of psychology, a sort of like shell-like situation. So I already had the idea and found a book, which was a sort of book about a study book from 1948, which was given to medical students, from which the object was photographed, in this sense, of course, humans, and they had to do a diagnosis. And I asked this psychoanalyst if they still had those books or just still used them, and he sent me a book on my return to Antwerp, which was called Diagnostische Blik. And from there, I made several cuts into the imagery, but I also changed the eyes, so that the eyes will not look at you, and you as a spectator will not feel or be able to feel any empathy towards the diseased that is looking at you. I also, of course, took not the ones with a very scary skin disease, but the ones that looked mostly normal in a sense, because this is the idea of the banality, which is more fearful than anything else. But by changing the eyes, and also by changing the way the paint was painted on the surface, in this way it was painted horizontally, in horizontal strokes, to flatten out the surface even more, and to make a grid so that you as a spectator are no longer entitled to go into the painting. These paintings are the most naturalistic paintings I've ever made, and therefore they miss the real completely, because they are totally symptomatic. That was also actually the aim of these particular paintings. And for this one, the one that comes up is a bit more poignant. So there you have this is actually not a man, it's a woman with breast cancer. And the eyes actually go over you, they just surpass you. So they just go, and that, I remember when I showed that the particular person who bought this painting, after 2 weeks after having bought it and after the show that he had it in his house, he brought it back because it was too annoying to live with. It now is part of the Pont Foundation in a long-standing loan. Because these paintings sort of have this very slight edge to each other, because they can sort of, in a way, control something, and not, as I say, because they are symptomatic. The other one that's totally symptomatic is the villas. You know, I'm part of my family, the one that was more wealthy, lived in the part of Antwerp called Braschaat, where you had this sort of like after the war. You had a lot of these sort of villas, which I don't know how you say it. The roof was made in straw. So you had this sort of idyllic idea of the suburb in terms of the Americas and then the Heidelberg German shit all put together into it. And these were the villas where I then could go as a kid to spend some time with the nephews and then also experience the shit that went out beyond, I mean, these facades. It was also the neighborhood where you would virtually never see somebody in the garden or in front of the house. And I was, of course, fascinated not by the grandeur of these bigger ones like this, but especially by the mediocrity of this element of, you know, a consolidated existence, of coziness and whatever, but of course it's all dirt in a sense. And the second one is also a total mock-up. This is a sort of mocked-up space which is called lamp room, which is impossible to grasp because in terms of depth, there is no real distance anymore. The importance with the work that I do is also that I always use a mirror while painting so I could use and turn the image upside down. The mirror is a specific element of sort of like doubling up the distance between you and the image. I think that is also one of the elements that's important, that an image should work from afar, and it works from afar very differently than when it works when you get close to it. So in that sense, it's an interesting point of departure. Now this was all coinciding and was made in the same year as a diagnostical view and was actually as symptomatic in a sense. It was about the facades, and this was out of a show called Repulsion. Going a step further, and this will come back as a wall painting, and I'll show you this right after that. This painting was made in '92 and is actually one of the Christmas figurines that my mother used to use underneath the Christmas tree. It was an angel which I actually sort of compressed to the point where it sat down and put the face into the shadow, where the sort of transcription of an object becomes an identity in the same time. By blanking out the face becomes actually an entity within this imagery itself. Years later, and I'm talking now about 2000, I'm not sure, 2010, when I did the show, I curated a show in Bruges called The Reality of the Lowest Rank, which was a show that I was asked to curate with a stronghold on Eastern European contemporary art. And me as an arrogant Antwerpian, because Antwerp's people are the smart asses of the country, and having visited Bruges many times, thinking it was stupid fucking Disneyland, was, of course, had to receive my entire thing about the city once I started working with these people, because from the lowest technician to the mayor, if they had to be there at 5 o'clock in the morning, they would be there. And this was their first attempt in a medieval city, which was completely protected by UNESCO, in which we had to build an installation architecture, which we did with Robrecht and Dahl, actually. And it was a fantastic show, it was a fantastic experience. So that changed my whole thing. And therefore, when in the only modern building that's there, right in front of the city, which is the concert hall of Robrecht, I think, I actually made a wall painting, which is the angel, which is still one of the wall paintings that exists. I made about 100 of them, and 3/4 of them have disappeared. They have been made out of pragmatical situations, like I couldn't get a painting, so in order to have the image in the show, I would repaint it in the show for the time the show actually would run, and then it would be overpainted in a sense. So it becomes like a very ephemeral oeuvre in a sense. But as I said, this is one of the 4, because there are only 4 or 5 that actually still exists, painted on a concrete wall, directly implanted actually on in this scenery and in this specific architecture. Another form of architecture is the one of an infant. You know, this is the children's room, the room you don't pick for yourself, which has been made for you, with the sort of colors, the pastel colors of the pink, the sort of rosy pink and the bluish, sort of also light blue that should be the comforting sort of environment for a kid, which it might not be, because it might be as well horror in a sense. In that sense also the room is totally emptied out and cleaned out in a way. Then 3 paintings which came out of a show called Intolerance, and which were actually built upon the fascination of mantelpieces. They were also hung, I forgot to put in a picture how they were hung in the gallery in '93. They were hung on the chimney walls of the Zeno X gallery, which is the old space. And the funny thing is, when we hung them on the walls, we didn't hang anything on the other wall, so the people that used to stand during the openings leaning on the chimney were now compressed against the wall. So it became very, as I said, intolerant in that sense. Now, why that? Because like with this painting, I actually sort of tried to assemble all the candle holders of my mother, with the most horrid one out of 1977 in the middle. And then put them in front of this sort of backdrop where they sort of vanish in the backdrop. Of course, in the back of my head, there was the element of Morandi that played out, in a sense, because you can sort of feel that idea, or that sensitivity, or the Latour, but this element of this sort of vanishing structure and this vanishing objects, in a sense, all having to do with the idea of amplifying an element of not only status, but representing something that is domestic and at the same time oppressive. Same goes for that. And this one, I think, is still in a collection here in Switzerland, where the flowers are cut off, so it gives an element of suspense, and everything goes into the materiality of the vase itself, actually. Then even more immaterial, pillows, because it's actually comes out of a publicity also. It was badly printed, so the colors went over sort of the boundaries of what was represented. And that was what made it very interesting for me to sort of amplify that, multiply that in a sense. Also the fact that the pillow is something that is formless. Anything that falls on it takes the shape of it, or part of the shape of it. And I found that quite interesting as a non-entity within an image, basically. This is a police photograph with a corpse on a couch, but with the idea of blacklight implanted on it. Another structure of some importance is this one, the Iron Tower, it's called, still exists, was a monument which was built actually by pacifists after the First World War. I mean, it's a very complicated situation. It's the whole situation of the Flemish cause. But in the First World War, I mean, at that point, of course, the upper class was French-spoken, so all the officers were French-spoken, but most of the footmen were not. They were Flemish. And they didn't understand the commands, so there were great losses, because when they said go left, they went right straight into German machine fire. And a lot of intellectuals, of course, were French-spoken, but started to, and there was, of course, the Flemish movement, started to sympathize. And out of that came this one monument, which is a tower in the form of a cross, which has the inscription AVWK, which means everything for Flanders, Flanders for Christ. This specific monument between the two world wars became a monument for the New World Order, which was, of course, tending to the fascist situation. Then there was a second collaboration, which is a bit more difficult. And in 1950, I think it was after the war, it was they detonated it. They sort of destroyed the monument. And in 1954, they rebuilt it, in a sense. So I tried to paint it on the idea of vanishing into the backdrop, in a sense. And of course, the yellowish lines have this uniformity that makes a sort of ambiguity between the monument and its history. Then something immaterial, sweat. It's like drops onto a cloth, which sort of magnify the space within your vision. And then the second image of Speer. This is Albert Speer in the snow in 1944, when he was already the Minister of Defense, and he prolonged the war with, I think, 2 or 3 years because he was so fucking efficient. And this comes out of a documentary in 1998, and it's a piece of home movie that his wife filmed, And right before this is shown in the documentary, this was the time that the Russians gave free a telegram, which is the only written proof. When they would have had it in Nuremberg, they would have probably hung the guy, in which he actually wrote to Himmler that he visited one of the working camps and thought that the detainees had too much space. In Overflow, you see him skiing down the slope, and then falls, and there's the moment that he turns around. I actually also preferred then to blank out the face, like the blank of the moment in the instance. It's also an image that clearly is transmitted because you see through the bluish hay, you see that it's an image that is actually transmitted. The funny thing is that I also encountered his grandson in front of this painting when it was shown in the Nationalgalerie in Berlin, who has the exact same name, which is really interesting. Also the fact that it's not recognizably Speer in a sense. It was made for a show, the very first show in Berlin, at Galerie Gebauer, which was still at the second floor in the Torstraße in Berlin Mitte. And I wanted to make a show about Architektur und Wahl. The idea of the fact that a guy like Speer, who didn't build that much, we of course know the Ice Cathedral, and we know some of the, and the Kanzlerei and so on, but in fact, nothing much except all these wild dreams of building a new Berlin was ever built. And it was also the idea that it was an architecture that should build in its ruins. It should build in the way it would decay within 1,000 years. So therefore the idea of Architektur und Schnee, so snow and architecture, it all came about. Same show you had a monument which is totally architectural, where you see the casemates built into a wall, and this little square that you see in the square is actually made out of human ashes. Then, same show still, the show was called The Architect. Another fascination, the fascination of Caspar David Friedrich. So I took, this is called the Blaue Eiche, or the Blue Oak. I just copied the drawing of Caspar David Friedrich, cut it out and put it into my studio and made a Polaroid of it, which deformed and deflated the coloring going into a sort of violet in a sense, and painted that. There's also shown the same space in combination with this official portrait of Himmler, which is actually deducted from the size of a photograph like this out of a book called Topographie des Terres, where this is hanging in the office of Heinrich. And I brought it back to, I think, the presumed real size, how it would have hung there, with also the shadow of the frame. So it sort of like keeps this ghostly aspect, which gives also the idea of the architecture of power in a sense. Then just a mock-up of a model that I made, hut or a habitat in its most iconic form, which I thought was interesting. Or non-spaces like the mirror. Mirrors are always been a fascinating element in my practice because they are the same as shadows. Shadows are non-zones, are actually also non-colors, and are the most difficult spaces to grasp. And it's, of course, a mirror where nothing is reflected. It's a mirror where there's always a point where you can see into a mirror where there's actually nothing to see. And it came out of the show called The Passion, this is one of the elements, which was a show about the Passion play in Oberammergau. There's also one object, the one that you see here hanging, that was in the show in Doha, which I did. This is a sphere made out of polyester, onto which I painted, because I went to this Oberammergau Passionsspiel with my parents in the 70s. It's about 7 hours. And I actually wanted to, in this show, The Passion, and at that point was 99, and I didn't have any idea that religion would be, again, important at that point, so I saw it as cosmetics, in a sense. And this all imagery was based upon this imagery from the 70s, where the villages, as they still do now, play Christ and whatever, but also the sort of entity of the theater itself, which is fixed in the landscape. And therefore I wanted to paint it on a balloon. But we didn't have time enough, my dealer and I, to get a real balloon, a weather balloon. So we found a sphere in polyester and painted it on that, and then hung it. So this is the balloon was made later, and is now inflatable, and it can float. And it's also, but it's in another collection. But this was the very first one onto which I painted very fast, actually, this sort of theater of Oberammergau. Another element of this pair is out of the colonial series called Monarchy Toko. And it's the leopard skin over which actually the king, King Baudouin at that point, not married, and especially not to be perceived as a chief because he was also childless, but he was the only one that could walk over the leopard skin, which was the iconic element of power. At the same time, it's also symbolic for the unknown in the terms of the fact that the unknown charted territories, in a sense. That's why I thought the leopard skin was really interesting as a depiction. It was derived literally from a film from André Couvin, which was a film made in 1955 in Technicolor. It was a very racist film because it starts with the propeller of the Dakota with which he lands, and you hear over voice, you hear like the moderator saying that then they go to a woman, a Congolese woman who's doing the hairdo of her kid, and then they're cleaning a crocodile, and the guy goes like, the wild people and the animals are preparing themselves for the coming of the king. On the other hand, it was an interesting point because this was the first time a king of Belgium went to the people of the Congo, which is interesting. And the same, I found actually a snapshot of one of the colonial people, which shows this apartment block. Now think of the fact that this was in 1955. I mean, this was in Leopoldville, now Kinshasa. Leopoldville and Kinshasa was much more modern than the entirety of Belgium in a sense, because these were all modern buildings, which was really fascinating in a sense to see that. I mean, it was also at that point stipulated that this would go on for at least 1,000 years. I mean, it was not already in the game that it would become independent 5 years later. Another structure which was always fascinated me is the mission post, which is the one you see here, which is actually the mission post into which two people were educated of any importance to the Congo, which was Lumumba and Mobutu at the same time. And the funny thing is that also Lumumba was actually the president of the evolved, or the evolués, so to speak. But, of course, not the power figure that Mobutu was in the far end. The structure here was interesting because it combines with the landscape and also the way the roof has a sort of impalling impact into the image. Another element which is not architecture but certainly a structure is how the people that breed pigeons actually decide upon how valid the pigeon is, and this is actually made out by the enlargement of the way the eyes or the eyeballs are actually implanted into the head of the pigeon. So here you see 3 of them. Then the pigeon cage with the pigeon shed. This is made from a maquette, actually. It's called Within. It was also based upon my conviction that pigeons are not the element of peace, but they're just flying rats. And this was also, well, they didn't put that one in, I forgot to put that one in. This was also enhanced by the fact that when me and my wife were visiting we were visiting some chateaus in France somewhere, and after visiting 3 of them, there was always this Pantheon-like structure in front of the gate, and I didn't know what it was. And so the second time I go in, and there's this French father with his kid explaining to the kid that if you would multiply the holes in the vertical line and the horizontal line, you get the amount of acres the land owns. So this was a pigeon house. And also the fact that the pigeons were, of course, livestock, but they were also messengers. There's still, in the Belgian army, there's still a regiment of pigeons who are messengers. So the people who worked the land were not allowed to have not to eat, but also not to have pigeons. So with the outbreak of the French Revolution, they just killed all the pigeons, which enhanced the idea of the flying rats, basically. Then another image of a non-image, which I always was fascinated, is this, comes out of a show called Nix, which means literally nix, not in a philosophical way, but even worse or less than that. And it was a show combined out of stuffed monkeys and this, which is I'm not going to show you the monkeys. This is like the projection of an empty slide on a wall. It's a sort of my deduction of Mark Rothko, except that I didn't ever want people, or would want people to cry in front of my paintings, which of course Rothko would have loved to have had. This is just the projection. Also amplifying the region where we come from, where it's all real in a sense. So it's more about the real than about the epitome of it or the esoterical bullshit that goes alongside with it. Another slide, it continues, and then the biggest one here. Boop. Then a painting that was literally put into a piece of, into a public space, which is called Dead Skull. It was based and it was made for the second document I was in, the one of Okri and Weza, where he actually wanted me to prolong upon the colonial thing, which I didn't want to do. So, and this is made out of a bas-relief, which still exists at the entrance of the cathedral in Antwerp, which is still the highest point of my city. And it's a bas-relief, which is a sort of commemorative plaque, which was made for Quinte Matsijs, who was the founder of the Antwerp Painting School. And the mythological story goes that he committed suicide by just jumping off the highest point of the tower of the cathedral, and therefore, of course, was not allowed to be buried inside of the cathedral, and therefore this commemorative plaque. Now, when I was asked by the architect, I think it was Neutlings, to do a public space work for a public space, I think I'm going to propose something they don't want to do. But of course, they wanted to do it, and then we did it. And that also, of course, it had to do with the city, because this museum, the Math, is a museum that is a city museum, so I wanted to make a connection to the city. So the next slide you'll see is this painting is now owned by the National Gallery in Washington. And then we actually put it into granite stones, and it's a sort of square of 40 by 40 meters in front of this museum, which is still there. And here you see how they're working on it. And it's made out of 11 colors of granite, which we found all over the globe. At first it was very difficult because they started to make tests in the same size, which is of course ridiculous. You have to make different sizes. So we, with a computer specialist, we worked on it. There's also a whole book of how it has been laid and so on and so on. And then eventually it was laid by Portuguese people. The first one ran away. So we had this sort of square of 120 on 80 on which we could always sort of make a different square with a particle of this mosaic. And here you can see it finished. So this is the Dead Skull from above. So it's literally bringing the painting first derived from actually a bas-relief as a painting back into stone, trying to keep an element of the painterly element within this format, in a sense. Then another image that's, I think, interesting because it's in a sort of like closed-off space, and it was an emblematic image because this happened, and it was a painting I painted after, because my wife and I witnessed 9/11. We come back to that later on in the story. And we were there and got stuck for 2 weeks because of it, and it was horrid. Eventually, when we got back to Brussels airport, there was this sort of cut-up light boxes of images of Bruegel, which were the most exact apocalyptic images you could actually think of. Bruegel, who was, of course, painting during the Renaissance, but was not believing into the sort of all-powerfulness of the human as a human, painted his people actually very small in the landscape. He was sent out by his people to go and study the landscape, but came back with the landscape, basically. And out of a different type of humanism and an element of humility, maybe, he painted these people very small. Of course, he also used the proverbs from the Middle Ages and sort of retranslated it with a sort of first form of journalism, which makes the impact all the bigger when we got back from this disaster. So months later, I found this image of a paintball contest in Detroit. This is what you see here. And it's a similar structure depicting these obstacles which are made out of inflatable forms behind which people can hide, and then this game, which is a game but is also propelling the element of violence, or a certain sort of personification of the idea of war. But then, of course, enclosed and inside as a game. Next image is Shanghai, was taken through one of the portholes of a bridge. And it came about because of a project I did in Shanghai. And as a kid, when I was 15, I wanted to visit the Bund in Shanghai. And once I got into the Bund, I was completely disappointed. And then I saw, of course, the new architecture on the other side of the Bund, which is amazing, because it looks like Dubai, but it isn't. And it's built very fast. It's also good that these Beijing and Shanghai don't have really a problem with earthquakes, because probably it would collapse very fast in a sense. But it has this sort of impressive idea of a futuristic city in a sense, targeted, of course, to one of the sort of rings of the bridge. Another element next to my door is the pharmacy with high sunlight on the sidewalk. Just an image that sort of like comes up and disappears and has this transparency, which is, I think, also interesting because of the fadingness of the imagery, and it makes it, giving it a sort of specific time zone to it. Then the Twin Towers of Brussels with heavy sunlight. Yeah, and then we come to another piece of film, which is this one here. I have to, let's see what it, good. And this. This was painted 2005. It's not 9/11, it's a demolition of a building block in Chicago in 1995. But of course, one shown in the show in New York, which was called Proper, which of course incites the idea of improper, and a show that was actually conceptualized out of my disgust of 2 legislations of Bush, which of course, at a certain point, even in New York, stupidity became like physically there. And but the image here is an interesting image because it's an image of something you cannot see, you cannot perceive. It's an image that the only thing that sort of indicates an element is the lamppost, the flagpost you can see there. It's an image that also masks everything you can see, blinds you of it. And it is, of course, the element of destruction, but destruction in the form of a cloud, within the visibility of invisibility in itself, in a cognitive sense, which I thought was interesting. Also with the different color schemes that go on into the transparency of the non-transparency of this image, and how you actually also develop the idea of weight, and also the idea of something that is actually, as I say, invisible. The second one, which was shown alongside, was the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, at that point, still the most powerful woman on the globe. It's not as big as you see it here, but it was this size, which if you would have painted the full figure, she would have been a monster. I decided to paint that. There were other paintings, but because she was the aberration within the Bush legislation. I mean, a woman who had accepted the schism of racism, basically, to get somewhere. Also a woman who was an enigma till this very day, because the fact that she's extremely contained. And it was not making moral judgment, because that I don't think that art should do, but it's really out of this fascination what this woman actually would add up to, which we actually still don't know. Once this was shown in this show, I still remember Thelma Golden, who is doing who is an African-American curator who saw the show before it opened and let out a shriek. So there were two responses to the show. There were Republican collectors of mine that phoned David Swan and said, we'll never buy a painting of Luke Teuilleman again. But years later, when I was doing a touring show in 5 American institutions, and when we hit Dallas, actually, and I just had finished putting up the show, I went to the Kimball Museum, which is a museum that only collects art up until the 19th century. And on my way out, there's a director who looks like a Navy SEAL who comes to me and he said, Mr. Teuilleman, it's just a shame we cannot collect beyond the 19th century because what you did for Condoleezza Rice is what Andy Warhol did for Marilyn Monroe. So it goes both ways. She was once asked if she saw the painting by one of my collectors, Lady de Rothschild, on the embassy dinner, and Linda Rothschild asked her, and she didn't turn her head because she asked, did you see your painting? It's now part of the Museum of Modern Art, which was a decision Glenn Laurie made overnight, even before the show opened. Very smart one, because he came to the point that it's a public figure, so it should be in a public collection. When not, it could be misunderstood. So it was shown several times, so maybe Condoleezza Rice saw it or not, but without turning her head, she said to Linda Rothschild, yes. So next, the park, an image that you could see through a surveillance camera nearly at the height of a dog. Fascinated by the idea of nature in the sense that it becomes also very estranged from itself and deep-rooted. A church. This was out of a series, out of the fascination with the Jesuits. It's not an important church, it's a church in Slovenia that I visited once, where most of the architecture is not architecture, it's just a trompe-l'oeil. So I think the only thing that's real here is this little piece and the altar, and the rest is all trompe-l'oeil, which is painted on the wall of the church, which I found actually fascinating. It also sort of enhanced this idea of the Baroque, which is a structure that's dynamic and goes up and goes up. It has this sort of rocket experience element into it, which I always hated. But once having to make this drawing the painting and figuring out the complexity of all these forms, I was quite astonished how complex it actually is in a way. And also convinced by then that it's part of the Western image building. It is, of course, a specific form of propaganda. Another image, the double sun. Came out of the same series. Of course, had to do with the idea of the spiritual and the light, but in this time, like juxtaposed in an image you rarely see, but it happens from time to time, the idea of doubling up of the sun. Then this is the place where the Israelis make their missiles. It's a small factory. It looks like also, again, a church-like structure or a mosque or something like that. Also the reminiscence to the Golden Dome in Jerusalem, but this is actually the factory where they make their missiles. It's now in the collection of the museum in Jerusalem. Another church, this time a Jesuit church. It's called The Book. It was actually photographed from a book of famous churches of the Jesuits with a Polaroid, but the insertion of the book sort of distorts the entirety of the image, which I thought was quite an interesting point. It's also quite a large painting. I think it's close to 3 meters, so it has this sort of thing. And again, the fascination with the idea of marble and the element of the depiction that was used with the Baroque, and what of course was used by the Jesuits in order to shock and awe, in a sense. And I found that there's many other images. There's also the one of the Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which is quite interesting because, of course, there it goes all out. From there, then this was still an element of the utopic and had maybe an element of humanism to it with a hidden agenda. We go to the first part of deleting it. This is a very large painting, I think one of the largest to date, and it comes from the very opening date of Disneyland. It is being taken off the website because the very first day of Disneyland, this is the entrance of Alice in Wonderland, there was a gas leak. And so Disney decided to take all the information out and do it again. where it worked properly. But this was sort of image of the failure. Quite interested because it had to be made in a very big format. And when this was shown, there was another one, Turtle, there were more bigger paintings. When this was shown in the gallery in New York in Days Finland, the Americans reacted pretty hard on that because I was getting into their format. And that was difficult for them to swallow. And of course, it was also Disney. Also, we got a message that Disney, the company, had their lawyers on to looking at what I was doing because they have, I mean, a zillion lawyers for the copyright. But of course, I didn't paint Mickey Mouse. I painted the environment. Why the environment? Because that was the most fascinating thing. It's the element of dehumanizing things in the sense that he wanted to go as far as to create a territory that he would completely control. And he would also control the fantasy of it, which is, I think, a step beyond, so to speak. And therefore, these images. Then, at the same time, this show I was doing, I got a pretty big show in the Haus der Kunst in Munich. And I decided, since I couldn't have the painting, to make it and reenact it again as a gigantic, even more gigantic, a wall drawing, which was made with chalk. And it was the space where you have das Mausenloch. That is where you go through the Goldene Salon. And what you should also know is that Hitler was quite a fan of Walt Disney. And in the end, when everything was going wrong and he was looking at the Wochenschaus without sound, he was also looking at Bambi at that point. And the funny thing was that when the opening came about, there were 5 drawings that came on auction of 5 of the 7 dwarves that he made drawings of, which we also put in the vitrine into it. This is also strange because this is the only disproportionate sort of way out of the gigantic spaces of the Haus der Kunst to the Golden Salon, which is original but doesn't match the conformities of all the other entrances. It was quite large. It was like, I think, 16 by 12 meters. So it was and it was interesting because, I mean, it's sort of like made this different turn into the space and how it's displayed with this also this architecture which is pretty weird in a sense. It's very fascistic, but at the same time it's a great space to do a show in because it's just out of control. The fact that they have to repaint the floor the whole time because it was built so fast that since the minute it opened it was crumbling basically. But it has this sort of representational space, which of course was important for Herzog de Meuron. I mean, because they made Dampfer architecture. This Troost made this, not Speer. So, and Troost made these cruise ships, you know. So, and I think when I see this architecture, this is the model for Herzog de Meuron. You know, like go at it, you know, corridors, things like that. And then another possible nightmare that Walt Disney wanted to make, this is the sort of wheel form maquette of his Epcot, which would be his ideal city, within the middle of the main tower. And around it you would have the suburbs. And there was also a tunnel situation underneath, of which I made several drawings, which I don't show here. And where he also separated the transportation of goods and the luxury transportation. Quite interesting. But this looks like a flying saucer in a way, so it's a good thing it didn't happen. Then an image that was made by the guy who founded Pixar and was thrown out of the company. It was the first sort of digitalized imagery of a space. Disney aborted the company for then far later on they had to buy them back in a sense. I don't know what this square is doing here. We have an empty square. Then I made another show, which was called Against the Day. It was a show shown in Wheels. And since Dirk Snauer didn't have any money to lend any work, I made him 22 no paintings. And it was all built upon fake. It was all built upon the virtual, in a sense, things that didn't exist. Like mock-ups of holes in the wall like this, or fake foundations like that. Or a fake office like this, which is totally virtual. That intertwined with a momentaneous, like a real element, which is the view of a sniper put onto a phone in real time when he does a hit in Baghdad. They deleted it pretty fast, but here you see the tower and you see the kill, basically. Then another virtual sundown. It's like completely made up. Then back to the fascination of the hotel room, but years later. These were like quite big, and they were just made unto measure actually one of the last shows in the old space in Antwerp. And then the title of the show was just the date. But it came out of this idea of, you know, the corporate vision of what your surroundings should look like. It goes from this to a more Roman assessment of the situation, you know. Or even like this, at least with an ashtray. And then the thing across my house, which is a broken glass that was there for ages, which I then actually photographed and turned into a large painting, which was called Morning Sun. It's now owned by Eli Broad, I think. Kind of liked it because it was this sort of decrepit element, and I always had been fascinated by windows, but not because of their transparency, but just because the things they forbid. And this show was actually a show that was called The Summer Is Over. And it was a show about my surroundings. And the title comes from the father of a colleague artist of mine who actually was already dementing then, and sat me next into the restaurant with my colleague artist, and at a certain given moment of lucidity said to me, "The summer is really over." So 2 weeks later he was dead. So it was also a show that was born out of the idea how the artist would look at his work and shit like that. So this is all about the direct surroundings of things that were in front of me, on the opposite side of the street, on the way to my studio, and whatever. And it happens that some of them were actually windows, like the broken window, and this is called the zoo, which is the backside of the zoo in Antwerp, with a specific light, not during the day, but at night. Another structure is this maquette that was made for an animation film of a parking lot. It's an animation film that's still ongoing between me and Kerry James Marshall. It's one of the project blocks in his backyard. Then a painting that was used on a window at the studio of Miroslav Balka, which is based on a film by Hans-Jürgen Zieberberg, Die Nacht, which shows this sort of idea of a structure, architectural structure, in a sort of element of dust that crops up. Then a guy in an architecture, this is Mr. Hasegawa. I made 3 portraits of him. This was when 1974 in his apartment, on the stairways to his apartment, and probably before he actually killed his student, who he partially tried to eat in the 70s. He was caught with the remainders of his co-student in the Bois de Boulogne. Then we come to the images I talked about in the arena. These are the images that I filmed and then actually repainted. And they were repainted especially for the show in Doha, because Shaika Mayasha said, "You have to make something about the region." And I said to her, "That's kind of difficult. It's like opening a can of worms, because you people are actually sponsoring like nearly every form of terrorism you can think of. So I'm going to make something for the region." So when I was then, a week later after the visit in Doha in preparation of this show, in front of the Pinturas Negras of Goya, I thought this has something to do with the region. And it reminded me of imagery that I filmed in the 80s that are similarly Goya-esque in a sense, and these are the ones. It's like, there's 6 of them, I'm not going to show them all. Then another image that was quite timely is called The Shore. It's the image of an execution, in a sense, before it happens. Comes out of a stupid movie called The Twist of Sand, and it's actually this is the sort of like intro to the movie without sound. And these are people from a submarine that get out of the submarine, before they are executed. And they wave a flag and then they come out separately. But at the same time, because it's black and white, there is this element of terror which is sort of encapsulated in this type of image. And then le mépris, the thing I talked about in the beginning. Also based upon the fact that I saw the film of Godard again whilst I was working on this imagery, which is not directly related, but I found also that Godard actually did something with the movie that escaped himself, in a sense. Also, you know that Brigitte Bardot is getting zilch of the dialogue she's saying, which is fantastic. The end is also fabulous, you know, between two trucks, and everything is in it. You have sort of the idea of the mythological, sex, distrust, and of course, also le mépris. It was also on one of the most iconic buildings of Malaparte, where for the last time you also see a filmed image of Fritz Lang. So it was interesting. But enfin, my idea was, of course, a different one. This is actually sort of like, yeah, it's polluted water, actually, around a foundation in Holland, of which actually there also carpets were made for the town hall, in a sense. And I reused that imagery to get this sort of murky water series, which is a triptych. This one is a bit more ridiculous. And this which shows the border, which is where you see also the shadow of a car sort of mirrored in this murky water, combined with a memory out of my youth, which is the flower corso in Zundert, which they still do. And it's actually, I also worked on it as a kid. These are structures which were made secretly by several communities in this village. This is also the village where Van Gogh was born, and my mother too. And I worked on these cars, which are made out of dahlia flowers. And then also on the day, it's only one day, when you have this sort of parade through it's the biggest one in the world, through the village. As a kid, you have to walk underneath the car and push it. I found these things, on the one hand, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. This is one that my father still photographed. And then there's a specific project with a specific building, which was one of the very first round exhibition spaces by Mesmerik, the famous Croatian sculptor. And it's, I did a show in it which was called Allo, which consisted out of 6 paintings that were shown there before they were actually sent to the gallery in London as the opening show, and 5 wall paintings. It's an amazing building, built in the 20s by Mesmerik, who actually should have built it, according to the king, a fantastic big sculpture there, but decided to build the first artist cooperative. Was put in jail, eventually went to the States, immigrated, never came back. During the war, this building was used as a mosque. After the war, of course, it became the Museum of the Revolution. And I actually did the very first show in it for what it was actually built. So the grandson of Mesmerik, this sculptor, came over from New York to be at the opening. So in the top floor, I hung the paintings, which are based upon a film. I'm not going to talk in length about that, which is the sort of like the predicament of a film, a biography about a painter, which is actually Gauguin in a sense. But anyway, and downstairs, I painted these plates on the wall. These are the plates from which me and my wife ate, and they were actually produced in the region of Zagreb. And of course, no longer, because after communism, this whole business was taken over by the Americans. But I was amazed by this sort of, just the inside, very abstract in a way, you see another image, just the change of the color of the light. And of course, they're circular. I mean, so they really worked with the space and makes indentations in it. This is one of the 80 or 90 ephemerical projects. So this was painted, I started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and clocked off at 2 o'clock at night. Then another one was called Ende, the second show in the Kunstkabinet in Bremerhaven, where I did a show with paintings in '93, and then in 2006, the Sun asked me to do a show. And this is sort of like a mythical place in Germany where a very fucked up engineer, Jürgen Wessler, and as crazy as Jan Hood, started to do shows in the 60s with Blinky Palermo, with Richter, with Rutenbeck, and whatever, up until now, with Henri Sala and so on and so on. And what he would do is actually, it's like a shop. So he would photograph at night the shop windows. You could always see the show from the outside to the inside, which was fantastic. So my idea was actually a little bit playing with the idea of Blinky Palermo that once made a mural of the window on the wall, and also the painting of Edward Hopper, Light, Sunlight in an Empty Room, one of the last paintings he made. So what I did, I said, we made linoleum on the tiled floor, painted it in a sort of grayish tone of white, and then I came back and then painted the white on it, which is what you see, which is actually sort of the light that falls into the space, but of course isn't. And that's why it's called Ende, or the end. You can see some more images. A wall painting that's still next to a hospital in Antwerp right now, and part of a thing that was a project that was started up in July and runs to July, is this part of a painting called Silence. It's next to a clinic. It's a sick child. And then the project that will stay is the one which is in the Atheneum in Antwerp, which is actually the first non-religious school in Belgium who was founded by Bonaparte, and now houses about 62 nationalities. At a certain point, they have a festival hall, which they sort of totally restored, and that was in '93, and the day after it was restored, because of a projector, a lamp, and a product, it burned down completely. Now they restore it in a way that the burned down element of the burning is sort of fixed in this festival. And the director, there was one painting that was in one of these niches that was saved because it was up for restoration, but it was called The Virgin of Antwerp, wanted me to fill up the other side, which is this image, which is actually a carnival in Munich in 1933 in front of the Haus der Kunst. So it goes full circle. Here you see an image of the full space. That's it.
Thank you, Luc. We still have some time for a couple of questions. But maybe I'll kick off with a question. I'll kick off with a question. You mentioned some collections or collectors, but could you elaborate a bit more on, because you're quite strategic on where the work goes, and if it doesn't fit or doesn't comply, that you actually sometimes buy it back. And could you also elaborate on that?
Well, first of all, when I started to work with, and I've been working on a very long-standing base with all my dealers, Frank de Macht is now going into 27th year of collaboration. David Zwerner is about 23, 24 years. Kiyoshi Wako is about 20 years. So they're very well-chosen collaborations, but there were also, once I started to work with them, I also said that 1/3 of the production should at least end up in public collections, which means museums, because I think that, and they would also be sold with a rabat. I mean, they could get, how do you call it, 30%, 40% off. So that it was important that important works would be at least in these public collections. And they actually, as to this point, did that to a point. I mean, they sort of honored that principle, which I think is important, I mean, for the legacy and, of course, for your cultural heritage, in a sense. And so, and also the fact that the other paintings which will be sold, so the privilege will go to, again, yet the most public ones, and that next to museums are private foundations. So it's important that that happens in such a way. Of course, it's always difficult to fight speculation, and in that sense we also had the power to re-buy paintings from auction houses. I'll give you a story that sort of will explain it in a better way. In 1992, just fresh after the document of Jan Hoed, I get the visit of two assistants of Saatchi in my little studio in Antwerp. And they proposed to buy an entire year of work for, at that point, 1 million euros, which was a lot of money. But I started to think, I said, when this guy buys an entire year, which is between 25 to 30 works, he sort of owes me. So I didn't go there. I said he can buy 1 or 2 paintings, or he can buy every year during 10 years a painting. So Mr. Saatchi then phoned me to tell me what kind of a jackass I was. And I said, just Mr. Saatchi, you wait until it's worth a lot of money and buy it from the retail market. Years later, we're talking about my show in the Tate Modern in 2004, and I knew he had bought a painting through J. Joplin, which was auctioned off to make it more valuable. So I wanted to go look at it because it was on the South Bank, and I was there again for a lecture with my wife. And I go look at the South Bank, and I see another painting, which was sold to an Australian collector, which was also in this then Saatchi Foundation. So I got afraid, because the biggest painting at that point, the still life, was bought by the so-called good collector in Australia that would give it as a promised gift to the museum in Sydney, which I thought was interesting to have the biggest painting at the other side of the globe. So then Saatchi does a show, The Triumph of Painting, and he put so much money on the table to buy works out of the United States collection and so on, and in the end he got about 9. And the day after the opening, he dumps them all on the market in the auction houses. So we had to immediately retrieve them. So this was his answer. That's where it becomes less sympathetic, in a sense. That's where it also becomes important that you have powerful people, also financially powerful people, that can sort of take care of that shit. So, because it's very easy, you know, to also see a gallery just as a shop, because that is not, it's not a shop. And at a certain level, as I say, it becomes less sympathetic. It becomes, and that's one of the big problems right now. If I think back, you know, when I started with David and I started as an artist, I was, of course, luckily younger than most artists now. Most artists now have a gigantic problem. I mean, I didn't have a strategy to begin with, that's one thing. And secondly, there were less art magazines. But there was also not a corporate art world, which we have now. And, well, my dealer in New York is part of a corporate art world. Since when I started to work with him, I was with the 5 first artists, and there was only 1 assistant, who is now running the operation in London. By now, the operation is run by 200 people in New York, 80 in London, and probably the same amount in new space coming up in Hong Kong. So, for a young artist, like take, I'm not going to name any names, but for a young artist that I know, that's just joined the gallery, and successfully though, a couple of years ago, he came to Antwerp to visit me completely petrified, because he is very well aware, although being 28 years old, also making the work of a 28-year-old, that he could easily be branded by the gallery. This is a problem. So there's less and less elements in the middle, and I think that is a necessity to differentiate this situation. Still a conversation I will have with David once it comes to it. But that is one of the major things, that and also the fact that there is no critical mass opposing that, because there's been curatorial studies, there's been a lot of sociology out of the 80s, which is totally obsolete when it comes to this day and age, and a complete misunderstanding of Habermas, not to say the least. So there is no real opposition, in a sense, which means that even my peers and the artists on the same level don't even meet. They meet in an airport and say hello and talk about the project, but especially not about the contact. That's why it was very appreciated that Tobias Rehberger last year organized a show for 100 artist friends that he had collaborated with or knew during his career so far, to make a work, maybe not to sell, but at least to have a dinner with these 100 people that they can be around the table to talk, just because that's rarely happened. So this is the fact that how the market completely isolates the artists, basically. And it's, of course, therefore a grave understanding to sort of criticize the idea of being commercial or not, because that's not even what's actually in question. What is in question are far more important things. Of course, you also don't bite the hand that feeds you, in a sense. Also, the other thing, which has also disgusted me for a long time, is that the people that invent inlay soles for shoes will never be held responsible for that on a moral level until they die. So, but if you make symbolical capital, you will, in a sense. But so these things have to be differentiated. That is for sure. And that's one of the big dangers that's actually happening right now as we speak. So maybe some of your questions. So.
Apart from the market, is there a specific kind of work that you want to be in public or in museum?
Well, I already said that first of all, if you become an artist, you don't set out to earn money or to get rich. I mean, if I would have done that, we wouldn't have this conversation, because genetically, I mean, the bastard father of my mother was a big businessman, so if you have tunnel vision, you will have the big money. It's no big deal. But that's not the point. The thing is that, no, it's important that the work is, of course, in a context that's interesting enough. And museums give you this context, collections give you this context too. I still prefer a public collection or a museum, but it becomes harder and harder for a museum to just get to the work. They will have to go in a sort of, a sort of mixture, I mean, which is also the Anglo-Saxon model, basically. And the fact that the Americans had so much opportunity is because these museums are private. The problem with that is that this belongs to the power of the 1% that owns everything. So you get a very uniform view of what this imagery of whatever decade or whatever will look like, because it's quite conform to what is available, but also will be propelled. And it's a very cynical sort of like movement from the one to the other. You know, the institutional world will sort of legitimize or validate the value of the work, because it's so-called past the filter of the experts. So this is also it's a very, very strange game, which is funny because, I mean, in the 19th century, an artist will not even appear in a museum. Maybe he would maybe get there when he was dead for 70 years, something like that. So also the inconsistency of a museum of contemporary art, to which I immediately reacted when the work cropped up, that is a contradiction sine qua non, because how can you have a museum of contemporary art? It doesn't fucking exist. So, but of course we have that now. So this is the things you have to deal with. And also, I think it's very interesting to realize that I myself as an artist will not have the same legacy as Goya or people like that. So the legacy you have, you'll have to work on too.
You know, this talk takes place in the context, in the frame of this novella of Melville. And there was a lot of interpretations, philosophical and literary, of this novella and hero of Bartleby. How do you position yourself in this context? What do you think about the frame of this lecture?
Maybe just to add, we asked our guests, so this is the frame that we created for ourselves. They don't have to comply to this, so it is not a one-to-one link necessarily, or there shouldn't be a necessarily link.
Yes,
It's
but
just more the attitude of I
but
prefer
this
not
is
to.
my question. That's all.
No, but it's rightfully a question. So, yeah, well, actually, the idea of the novel where the person in the end gets totally incapacitated by his refusal or postponing, delaying any decision making is a little bit opposed by what I'm saying, which turns out actually eventually the same. What I'm trying to say is that eventually when you become an artist, you don't become an artist to win. It is actually how you lose, which is the most important thing. And around that, there's also a big difference between the making of an artwork and the art world. They're two separate things. They have nothing in common with each other. But out of this discrepancy, there is an element of validation, which is, say it a bubble of air or not, but it is seen as an important evaluation within society. Now, this element, together with apprehending it or denying it, the coin goes both ways. So maybe that is maybe the only link I could have with the title of this program. And in the work, of course, also. There's an element of denial in that work. The fact that I started to show the paintings on the exact wrong moment, which was the success of it also. The fact that you also become an artist out of conviction, which is an important thing, because if you don't have the conviction, you can't go on. These are elementary things. And seeing the times we are living now, it becomes more and more important to persevere in just the artistic production of being creative, for that sense.
Good questions? Okay, let's go to the bar. Thank you, Luc.
Yeah, okay, thank you.